Hello, everybody. It's Saturday night at 10 o'clock Eastern time. I am Chris Weuve. This is Starfleet Tactical, and I have with me frequent guest Chris Carlson. So, Chris, welcome back.
Thank you, sir.
How's life in the frozen north?
Frozen?
Of course it is. Is your lake frozen yet?
Oh, yeah. In fact, the guy who likes to plow the walking path around the lake went by today. So I now know it is thick enough for me to walk on. Okay,
that's good. That's good. So let's see. Today we're going to finally talk about the last session of the Mike Bosworth stuff, which does not mean that this subject will never come up again, because of course the way this show works is it's worth pointing this out that I do this both intentionally and unintentionally. I guess the right way to say it is I've decided to make a virtue out of necessity. Frequently, we go back to old topics again, and that's because I'm constantly thinking about it, and I'm constantly talking to people like Chris about old topics, and I constantly find another angle about it. And also just, we're 156 episodes in, and it would be silly for me to assume that somebody who just discovered the show went back and watched the previous 155 episodes. And so I do make a point of trying to go back and bring back old topics and dust them off a little bit and talk about them again. If for no other reason than, we got new people coming in, and it's worth going back and sort of re-examining some of that stuff. So
besides, once you get back to the ships of Traveler, you're going to get back to this concept.
Yeah, exactly. And it is funny that you mentioned that. I'm going to talk about that in just a second. In fact, let me go ahead and bring up the slides. And Lissa, I'm going to make a little mod here. So there we go. So Lissa is in the background. Lissa's the producer. If things are going well, it means Lissa doesn't have a whole lot to do other than to launch us and
yeah. If things go well, I am a glorified mod.
Yeah. So frequently she'll throw. I mean, she spends a lot of time throwing stuff up, etc. We have had shows, although not really on Starfleet Tactical, but in the conference that Lissa's helped me out with in the past. We have had instances where we had a technical issue that was taking place, that she's working the technical issue behind the scenes while I'm doing the song and dance, trying to keep things going.
I felt so bad for that one guy. I think he was in Brazil at the time, and their internet was at the time was known to be having an issue. And he was one of the guests, and every time he'd pop back in, I'd be like, I'm so sorry.
So there was a little bit of hand-holding that needed to happen. And every now and then we run into somebody who, there was one other guy who, he forgot everything we taught him about StreamYard in the week between when we did the practice session and when we actually executed the conference. He forgot everything there was to forget about how to share slides and stuff like that. So, but I appreciate the fact that Lissa is here and helping out. Even though most of the time there's not a whole lot for her to do, but I appreciate the fact that she's here doing it. So,
and if you guys ever want to support me, there's a Linktree thing, I think, that's normally put below the videos.
There is in the explanation for the video, there is a link to her site and so please support her. So
yeah, do the things, especially because the TikTok ban's potentially actually going through. So, I get my money, at least part of it, from doing TikTok things. Like I am in the creator fund and whatnot. So, yeah.
So, okay. So, let's see. Did I forget to change it? Yeah, I forgot to change it. It should be episode 156. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
154 is if we had done them all in order, 52, 53, 54.
Right.
This should be 56. Sorry about that. Okay, so here's sort of the general admin side of things. You'll note that big ass blue arrow says that when the new year rolls around, first show of the new year, going to move the show to 9 o'clock Eastern time, 8 o'clock Central. Only a couple of people had any sort of issue with it whatsoever. One of them, unfortunately, is Andy Presby. So that I think I specifically said the new default is going to be at this time. If necessary, to allow a guest to participate, we'll do a 10 o'clock show. Most of the time we'll do 9 o'clock shows because I think it'll certainly increase my quality of life because it'll allow me to get to sleep earlier. And I wake up early regardless of what time I go to bed. So I'd like to be able to get to sleep a little bit earlier. But I think it'll work better for most people. So that's the plan. In the new year, we're moving an hour earlier. Also, I've got you'll note I've got the next 3 to 5 topics. I think there are 6 things listed there on the next 3 to 5 topics because I can't count. And there's 2 that I haven't had on that list before. There's the previously mentioned Traveler stuff, which has been on the list forever. The thing about Traveler is I know that when I go down that path, Traveler is big. There's lots of stuff, just the Martin Doherty stuff by itself that I want to talk about. There's lots of stuff about how navies work in Traveler. And so I don't really want to do it as, let's talk about this book, let's talk about this book, let's talk about this book. It'll probably end up getting organized that way. But I want to basically read it all and then go back and start putting together the pieces parts. And so that means I need to allow myself enough time to have read through about 500 pages worth of RPG material, probably. So I don't want to make it sound like it's a hardship. It's going to be fantastic, but it is a lot of reading. And so in order to do it right, I keep kicking that can down the road. 2300 is a easier lift in that regard. So I may end up doing it first. Albedo is an even easier lift. So for those who do or don't know about it, for those who don't know about it, Albedo, the Albedo Anthropomorphics RPG is based upon a comic book series from the 1980s, late 70s, early 80s that ran into the 90s. And specifically, Albedo was an anthology series, and the part of it that we care about is Irma Felna EDF, which got turned into the Albedo role-playing game. And it's a relatively hard science role-playing game that involves space combat and some really well-designed ships and some furry animals, anthropomorphic animals, furry stuff. I don't. It's a furry thing, but that's not why I'm into it at all. It's a very interesting hard science background. There's some really good politics and stuff. So if you like furries, you already know about this. If you don't like furries, don't let that put you off. I want to spend some time doing that. And I just discovered, like, literally today, or maybe it was yesterday. I think it was yesterday. I discovered that there was an Albedo game I had never heard of. That there was a tactical skirmish game with miniatures that came out about 5 years ago that I had never heard of. And so now I'm the proud owner of this because it's got a background source book and stuff like that. So I'm looking forward to doing something with that. Oh, and also I have listed there the Star Trek Power Systems talk. That is a talk that Andy Presby does. When we get Andy in to do it, it's going to be 3 or 4 episodes. Andy and I have to sort of figure out how to split it up. Andy is his background is that he's a retired naval officer. He was a submariner. He's got a degree in spacecraft design. So he knows how to operate nuclear reactors. He knows how to design spacecraft. He works in spacecraft propulsion in his day job. So his comment is that his real world day job is to try to build impulse engines. So that's a fun talk. Any artwork that I show, of course, is is for purposes of critiquing, etc. I think all this stuff actually in today's episode came from the government, so I don't think that's a big issue. I do want to emphasize, though, that we're going to be talking about some people who are real world people who are still alive and who have absolutely no idea that I'm talking about them on this TV show or in this YouTube show. And so, you know, they may dramatically disagree with my interpretation of stuff. So I don't want to put words in their mouth. The words are my words. The words are Chris's words. And also, as usual, we don't speak for our well, Chris speaks for his employer because he's self-employed, but I don't speak for my employer. Okay, let's see. So today we're talking about the well-deck combatant part of this. I'll do a little bit. There's going to be a little bit of an update on a LCS thing that Chris and I actually haven't talked about yet. Then I'll do a little bit of a recap of what we talked about before a couple of episodes ago. And then the last time we talked about the carriers of large objects piece, we talked about large ships that had well decks. This is about the things that go in the well decks that aren't just landing craft. The idea here was that they came up with the idea that we've got these well decks. Maybe we could use them for something other than landing craft. Maybe we could use them for something that looks a lot like what later turned into Street Fighter and LCS. The Street Fighter side of it more than the LCS side of it. Mm-hmm. And so a deployable surface combatant. And so we're going to look at some of the designs they came up with there. And there's the main citation there, basically all the illustrations, all the line illustrations that are about the ship stuff comes from this article. But first, let's talk about LCS, and let's talk about this thing. Have you seen this, Chris?
Oh yeah, it's been talked about for a few years now. It's what, the Mark 70?
Yeah, this is the Mark 70 VLS system. Basically, it takes VLS tubes and puts them into a container, and they travel horizontally, and then it lifts them into a vertical position, and it's a 4-tube strike length VLS cell. And they're gonna put them on the decks of some LCSs when they deploy. And you can see there's illustrations there that show LCS with these things on the deck. What the hell are they thinking?
They are struggling to find a role for all the money they've spent on these platforms.
I can see this as a situation where, let's go ahead and try it. Let's see if it increases our flexibility. The part that makes me wonder about this, though, is that they're clobbering the flight deck.
Yep.
And especially in the LCS2 class, where you've got that huge flight deck, and now you can't use it at all. And not only that, I haven't heard word one about what they're going to put in the mission bays. Fuel bladders? Extra food?
Don't.
I mean, not even torpedo reloads for the helicopter, because they're not carrying a helicopter. I also look at this and I go, okay, I understand why you might want to have more strike tubes available in the fleet. But if you were doing this, Chris, would you immediately go to, I want to put big missiles on this, or would you? Because my reaction would be Tomahawk, or not Tomahawk. Harpoon is really easy to install.
Yeah. The question you have to come up with is it small enough where I'm still I'm not going to take up the entire flight deck with a meaningful salvo.
The thing about Harpoon is, I think you could put Harpoon forward.
Well, they're putting NSM forward. In fact, this one already has NSM.
Okay, well that's a good point. That's a good point. The other thing is, I look at this and I go, why are they only putting one? If you're going to lose, you put a big container like that, you're not going to try to land a helicopter next to that container.
Agreed.
So why not put 2 or 3 containers?
You know, what's really kind of funny, Chris?
Yeah.
Is the Russians have already done this.
Oh yeah, this is the I can't remember the name of it. What's I'm sorry, what?
The Baikov PGG. It's the Project 22160.
Oh, I was thinking of specifically of the containerized launching system.
No. This is a combatant that has 2 containerized launchers, but they're in recessed positions, so you keep the helicopter pad.
You know, I was having a conversation with, I think, maybe Andy about this, and I said, you know, why not just cut holes in the flight deck and have the flight deck be liftable and put them in the mission bay? And
venting in the mission bay is probably a bad idea.
Oh, but see, you got vents.
Yeah, but they're in the mission bay.
Yeah, okay, but if it lifts up, it's still
venting in the mission bay.
Make the tubes longer. Make the tubes longer. So for those who wonder what I'm talking about when I say the vents, if you look, there's some round. If you look at the containerized thing, you've got the big square missile launching part. In front of it, there's a couple of shorter round tubes. Those are vents. Those are where the rocket exhaust comes out of. Because a VLS has to have a vent. It's a hot launch system. And if you look at a VLS cell, there's like little vents next to it. And if you watch a video of a launch, you can see there's this like this basically wall of flame that comes out next to the launcher.
Actually, you know what I was wondering is, since this is a traditional 20-foot equivalent unit, this is a Mark
40.
Okay, maybe 40. This is a Mark 41.
Yeah.
I was wondering why they didn't do it. Why they didn't try and redo a 57?
Is the 57 is the one that's on the Zumwalts?
Yeah, they're concentric canister launchers. You don't need a vent. It's built into the tube.
I don't know.
Maybe they're just too big and you couldn't get 4 in there.
It might have something to do also with the weight of the container, that they wanted to keep the weight of the container within a certain parameter. Because remember, this started off as a ground launch thing.
Oh yeah.
You were going to be carrying around on a truck, and so there may have been some constraint there. And you know, for all I know, the constraint had something to do with like an LCAC or something.
I have no idea.
So, but speaking of LCACs, let's go talk about well deck combatants. But I thought this was kind of interesting when I saw it. Now, there's a bunch of other stuff we could also talk about. We could talk about them putting the hypersonic strike missile on the Zumwalt class.
Yeah, that's a much bigger piece of kit, and it's a hypersonic glide vehicle.
I had lost lock on the fact that it was a glide vehicle.
No, it's the Dark Eagle.
Yeah, okay, it's Dark Eagle. I didn't realize it was Dark Eagle. I thought it was
that's definitely attacking a fixed ground structure.
Yeah. Hypersonic is really hard, and so we're very quickly going to get to the point where I'm going to start talking about the question you need to ask yourself when you're thinking your way through this. The question that one should always ask oneself when you're talking about hypersonics is, do I really, what does this get me that I don't have with just like a supersonic missile? And sometimes the answer is it gets you a lot, but sometimes the answer is it doesn't get you much at all. It might complicate the defender's intercept, but sometimes the question to ask yourself is, do I need to go hypersonic, or can I just fire a couple of extra ones and swamp them that way?
Traditionally, the big thing with hypersonic is it denies engagement opportunities because the closing velocity is so high.
Yeah. It means you've only got one shot if you've got that at all. So,
well, depending upon a lot of people forget that Aegis was designed against a Mach 4 target. It's the AS-4.
I did not realize it was designed against a Mach 4 target.
Yeah, AS-4 fired from a backfire. That's what drove the whole thing.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. So, all of a sudden it's Mach 5. Is it horribly better? Not necessarily.
Yeah, and my point in all of this is, don't just automatically assume that because it's hypersonic that means it's better. Don't just automatically assume that because you can do something that's the right answer. A lot of times somebody will say something, they'll go like, well, of course X is true, and everybody goes, oh yeah, X is true, and it turns out X is not true. X can be a very reasonable assumption. So a conversation, and I think I've told the story before, I'm going to tell it again now. A conversation I've had a couple of times with people is about whether having a loyal wingman type thing, an unmanned aircraft teamed with a manned aircraft. One of the things that you always hear about this is that it will mean that you put fewer pilots at risk, fewer aircrew at risk. And I've said to people, okay, where's the study that shows that that's true? That's an assumption. That is not a conclusion. That is an assumption. And they look at me funny, like, well, of course that's true, Chris. What are you talking about? And then I point out that if you go back before we had Predator squadrons and you read all the literature on having unmanned squadrons, they all said you'll be able to reduce personnel costs because it's unmanned, right? As it turns out, on a per platform basis, Predator squadrons have more personnel than anything else. And that's because when you take the cockpit out of the aircraft and put it in a room, your cockpit is now the size of a room. And you can fit more people in a room than you can in a cockpit.
And you can fit them in there for days.
Yeah. And so you can, when you've got one of the features of this aircraft is that it can fly for 12 hours or 15 hours or whatever. And so you end up doing shift work with one aircraft flying. And so my point is not that people are stupid. They weren't stupid. This was a perfectly valid assumption to make for planning purposes. But it was an assumption, and at some point you need to sort of sit down and hire somebody to do the study where you sort of figure out, is that assumption valid or not? If you don't have time for a study, make your assumption and try to justify it. If you do have time for a study, do the damn study. Figure it out. So, okay, on to some context. These are some slides that we've seen before. So you may recall, everybody, that Mike Bosworth and the crew at what was then the David Taylor facility and is now called Naval Surface Warfare Center, Carter Rock, they were exploring the idea of a new fleet architecture that would look different than the current fleet architecture. This was back in the late 1980s. In fact, we're now at the point where they said it would be a 40-year transition period. If that transition had started right when they first started talking about it, we'd be on like year 36 of the 40-year transition. And so one of the things was, what exactly would you build in this sort of fleet architecture? And they talked about aircraft carriers, that there might be fewer of them, and they because they were going to offload some functionality to other platforms. And that's a can of worms that that we could spend an hour talking about. Let's not. They talked about carriers of large objects, basically a lot of different ships that had some very common features to make the targeting problem harder. And then they talked about scout fighters. And scout fighters came in two different variants, one of which was something that looked basically like a destroyer, but it would be kind of used as a stealthy destroyer. But the other one was something that looked like that they called a deployable scout fighter. And that's what we're talking about today, is these deployable scout fighters. The idea is that they'd be deployed out of a well deck. So where do the well decks come from? The well decks come from these things, which are the generic ships that they talked about building. Now, this is what you'd end up with, something like this, when you got to the final end stage of it. But in the meantime, a variant of this would also replace the amphibs. But in the meantime, while you're waiting to get to that point, you're going to have amphibs still in the fleet. And so anything that you can put in a well deck, you can put in a current amphib, or you can put in one of these new things. And the idea is that the well deck would vary in size. That orange portion there would vary in size by the type of ship it was. Some would have big well decks, some would have small well decks. Everybody would be able to carry at least one LCAC, which an LCAC is like 87 feet long. So think of it in sort of increments of 90 feet. So the natural length of well decks would be 90, 180, 270, or 360, depending upon how many of these things you wanted to carry. And so that's sort of the going in assumption that they were making when they started talking about building things to fit in the well deck, is that that's the size of things you'd have to fit in, with some other constraints on height and width and stuff like that. And we'll get to that in just a moment. Anything I've forgotten there, Chris?
No, that's pretty close.
Okay. So, and anybody who's just seeing this for the first time, look at episodes 152 and 153, especially 153. All these slides so far came right out of 153. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about context, specifically media, and by that I mean the sea and the sky, air and water, and helicopters. So most of the time on this show, I'll talk about the difference between an aircraft carrier in a terrestrial setting versus aircraft carriers in space. And one of the things I always point out is that the media is different, right? An aircraft carrier is a way of having your cake and eating it too. It's a way of being able to take advantage of the fact that you can optimize things to fly through the air, and you can optimize things to be on the surface of the water. And water gives you the ability to build really large things that have really long endurance and can be reasonably stable. And the air gives you the ability to have high performance, long range, but limited endurance. And this is a little bit different, that we're talking about things that are actually going to be on the water. So it's not a difference in the media, because we're talking about big things that float and we're talking about small things that float. We're not really talking about things that fly. But we're talking about them in the context where things that fly still exist. So it's like space in that it's the same medium. It's unlike space in that in space you've got space, whereas in this situation you can still have airplanes and helicopters and things like that. They're still available to use for missions. And so I would argue that you should always ask yourself the questions: would this mission be better done with an aircraft? And can that aircraft be a helicopter? Because if I can make it a helicopter and I'm not wedded to a big flight deck like on an aircraft carrier, then it might very well be the case that the right answer is to do it in a helicopter. space, you know, you don't need a big flight deck. You can just sort of push stuff out the door and it floats away. On the Earth, you do need a big flight deck for big fixed wing, but you don't need a big flight deck for helicopters. So, anything to add on that, Chris?
I think you need to add to your media that obnoxious force called gravity.
Yeah, and things like the curve of the Earth and altitude and stuff like that. Which, so all that stuff. In a lot of my talks, I have a section that I call History, Hiding, and Hydrodynamics. And in the hiding, I talk about the 4 ways that navies can hide from each other. And you can hide behind the curve of the Earth. You can hide behind the interface barrier. You can hide through the use of distance and space, basically big ocean, small ship. And you can hide using low observable technology, i.e. decrease your signal so that you get lost in the signal to noise ratio. And so that's one of the things that you know, out in space, the thing that I think is frequently left out of that equation is that you can play games with altitude and you can take advantage of that. And in this particular case, if I'm in a helicopter, I can take advantage of altitude variations. If I'm on a small surface vessel, I've got a nearer horizon than I'm on a large surface vessel. How far is the horizon from a periscope? I haven't done.
Well, it depends. Horizon, couple of miles. But if a mast is sticking above, remember when you're looking, it's height of eye of your sensor and height of eye of the target.
Yes,
so
yes. So if the mast,
you can see a large ship, you know, 10,000 yards away, 14,000 yards away, but all you're seeing is the mast.
Yep. So, and then with surface ships, you get to play interesting games because like radar is line of sight, except when it isn't.
Yeah, ducting.
And so you want your radar up high because it lets you see farther, but you don't want it up too high because if you're close enough to the water, you've got ducting effects. There's an evaporative duct that will cause the radar to basically bend around the curve of the Earth. And so you can get added range against sea skimmers. And so that's one of the reasons why each and every morning, one of the things they always brief is what's the range of the day. And they do that for both sonar and they do that for the radar system. Like how far do we think we can see with the duct? And that changes based upon the weather and it changes based upon the time of day, right? You get different answers in the day and different answers at night. And everything I just said is available in a basic book on naval radar. This is all like pretty basic physics, right? This is nothing here is out of the. Nothing here is particularly unknown. The trick is knowing exactly what a given radar set is capable of taking advantage of, right? You can calculate the theoretical possibilities, but in theory and practice are the same. In practice, they frequently are not. So,
and depending upon the particular radar, it's besides its range, its bearing resolution may not be sufficient at such a longer range that it provides targeting data, but it provides track data.
Yeah, that's something that people don't frequently fully appreciate. And I will admit, I didn't appreciate it for a long time. The difference between track quality data and targeting quality data. Track data is just enough, tells you enough to be able to point a high fidelity sensor in its direction. And that high fidelity sensor might be in the nose of the missile you're firing.
The way to think about it is track quality data is past tense. Targeting quality data is future tense.
Yep, that's a really good way of thinking about it. And you know, Aegis has an advantage in that it's one system, it's one radar. Back in the old days, you had your search radar and you had your fire control radar, and it had to do a pass off. And so you've got two different systems you need to calibrate. And frequently they had different fields of view. In fact, it was guaranteed they had a different field of view, right? Because that's why you weren't using the same system for both. And so getting everything lined up was kind of tough. And shooting off of somebody else's track was like
Not gonna happen.
Yeah. Somebody else's track let you put your radar on it. And you could play reindeer games like if you know that the guy's going to pop out behind a mountain, right? Your radar saw, or the track showed that the guy went into the valley over there, and you know he's going to pop out over there. You can take your fire control radar and tell it to paint that space and just look for it, and you can skip the search step and go right to targeting. So, but those opportunities are few and far between. And that's the sort of thing that's the difference between a real professional Navy and some guys who just bought some good gear, is being able to do stuff like that. These days, he just does it all for you. So, okay. Lots of interesting stuff going on in the chat. We'll come back to it later. Okay, so here's what we're talking about here: advanced marine vehicles, and there's a short list on the left. Air cushion vehicles, hovercraft, surface effect ships. Surface effect ships are like hovercraft, except the sides are beefier and the sides actually are in the water. And then you've got a skirt-like function at the front and the back to sort of let it go through. And you're riding on a bubble of air, but the sides are actually in the water. Hydrofoils, swath, which is basically, you've got it looks like a catamaran, but it's a little bit, how it handles flotation is a little bit different. Submersibles, and wing and ground effect, which is, look up Caspian Sea Monster if you don't know what that is. Basically, you get some cushioning when you're close to the surface of the water. And so you can actually have something that leads to a very interesting debate about whether it's an airplane or a ship.
To most combat systems, it's a slow airplane.
Yeah. Yeah, but it's a slow airplane that's like no more than 50 feet above the water the entire time.
Okay, and a harpoon cruises at under 50 feet. What's the deal?
Yeah. Oh, no. I wasn't arguing the point. I was just providing some context. And so the end result of all these things is that you end up with something that really is kind of between an airplane and a ship. The comment is that advanced marine vehicles do not become advanced without some cost or penalty, right? Because in most cases, if you want to do this cheaply, you just have something that sits on the water, right? Just like every other ship, it sits on the water. It does the displacement thing. These are all special things, and so generally you pay some penalty. If nothing else, they're always more expensive, but they generally have things like less endurance in a ship, but more than an airplane. They're slower than an airplane, but they're faster than a ship. They don't carry as much as a ship, but they carry more than an airplane. And they have better sea keeping than something that would just be, the same size that would be floating on the water. But airplanes have the advantage that if you go up high enough, you don't have to worry about what the sea state is. Mm-hmm. You can just sort of skip that sea keeping stuff. And so they're this really sort of weird hybrid thing there. And as a result, you can look at this and you can go, yeah, I can understand why you'd want to do this. You'd be able to, okay, I can get something that doesn't require a big flight deck for like fixed wing stuff. I can make this work. So now here's a little bit more in-depth discussion about these things. So this has a list of all the different sort of features that they all have, all the good things that they have, like submersibles are stealthy, and you know, some of them have shallow draft and some of them don't, and stuff like that. So this is sort of a list of all this stuff. And I should, now's a good time to point out that the paper made a point of saying that this is not an exhaustive study. The person who put this all together, this part of it together, had designed some of these things, had read about some of these things, had studied some of these things, and a few other things just sort of like went, yeah, this is the case, right, Bob? Yeah, this is the case. So it's not an exhaustive study, and the person who put this together is not equally knowledgeable about all of these things. So that having been said, it didn't specify which author, and it didn't specify which things they were experts in, you know, which things they had designed and which things they hadn't. But when they went to the next step where they sort of down selected and designed a couple of these things, like at one point they were going to do 3 of them and they ended up only doing 2 because the guy who was going to do the third one like left the project, and they decided just, all right, we just won't do that one, because they didn't have somebody with that level of expertise. So I think what that means is the 2 things that they designed, they had people that had that level of expertise involved with that. Okay. So this is a chart that comes directly out of it. And if there's a black circle there, it means that it's highly capable. If it's white, it means that it's got less potential capability. This is all potential because none of these systems exist yet, right? They're making some assumptions. If it's crosshatched, it's sort of in between. I've marked out the 2 that they went with, which was a surface effect ship and what they called a hybrid hydrofoil, which we'll explain in just a moment. You'll see that the last one, surface displacement, is just like, what if this thing floated just like a regular ship? Planing is something that looks more like a World War II PT boat, where it's got that sort of relatively flat, you know, V-shaped, but sort of shallow V-shaped hull. And
yeah,
the
hard
idea,
chine.
I'm sorry?
It's got a hard chine.
Hard chine, that's the word I'm looking for. It's got a hard chine, which means that when it starts going fast, it sort of gets up on the small area of that hull, and it's a speedboat. Basically, it's a speedboat, right? When it starts going fast, it gets up on that you've got less wetted area of the hull, decreases drag, allows it to go faster. So, that's different than just a regular displacement vessel, and so you can sort of see what they're comparing it against. In all of this. Any thoughts on this, Chris?
No.
All right, moving on. So here's the general missions that they talked about. They point out that the U.S. Navy is very much of a forward presence Navy, which it basically translates into, if for the U.S. Navy to do anything, it's got to cross an ocean first. And so there's always an issue with crossing an ocean. And in the old days, up until the 21st century, one of the attributes of the U.S. Navy was that we had lots of big ships, but we didn't have a whole lot of things like minesweepers and stuff like that. We relied upon our foreign partners to do that stuff. So why did we do it that way? Well, because in general, the foreign partners were local to the area that we were going to go to. Those ships don't have a whole lot of capability to cross oceans. It's hard to get them across an ocean. And it was the sort of stuff that the locals could build anyway, right? They've got smaller shipyards, can build smaller ships. And so it was just easiest to say, okay, you guys build the small stuff and have it in place, and then we'll bring the big stuff over and we'll marry up there, and you guys be the specialist in the small ship stuff, the flotilla operation stuff. If you remember back to when I talked about Julian Corbett and the battle fleet and cruisers and the flotilla is the workaday small ships that do the sort of small patrolling and minefields and putting down minefields, taking up minefields, all that sort of stuff. The sort of nuts and bolts, hop on the beat sort of stuff that doesn't get the big press. And so our idea was we're going to let our allies do that stuff. So for this particular exercise, they looked at a handful of missions, and the one they focused on was anti-submarine warfare. And they focused on that one because they said it was the most complex of all of them. And this entire paper is talking a lot about like mission packages and stuff. It's really interesting reading because it's a good 5 years before LCS, but they're using all the same words. I think that is not so much that, these guys are brilliant. It had more to do with the fact that people have been talking about things like modularity and mission packages and stuff like that for a while. It all came together in LCS, and we actually decided to build it, but those ideas weren't new. And then they talk about deploying what they're calling the multi-mission deployable vehicle, the MDV, from the well deck of one of these big ships that I showed you the illustration of. And there were some requirements about what it needed to be able to do. They talked about, in general, you could deploy these things from a well deck, which is what they decided they were going to do, or you could use a crane. We talked about Le Foudre, or just Foudre. We talked about Foudre deploying torpedo boats. Okay, yeah, the crane stuff is hard in any sort of sea state. You could deploy it with a moon well, right? Like probably more like a catamaran in between the floats of a catamaran, or a waterline elevator. You could just sort of, instead of like the elevator of an aircraft carrier going up to the flight deck, you could conceivably have one that went down the side and went into the water. And well decks are easy. We know how to do well decks, so they went with well decks. Thoughts on that, Chris?
Well, as we're looking at it, another reason why they went with well decks is because moon wells are hard to do. Waterline elevators get wet.
Yep.
Hard to maintain them. And as you pointed out, and if you look, when we look at the size of the ships they're talking about, most cranes couldn't lift them.
Yeah, and basically when it boils down to, they went with well decks for the same reason that amphibs went with well decks, right? It's not like these guys were the first people to think about, how do I put a boat in the water? Yeah. Well decks are just easy. So easier. Okay, so the first version they did is the surface effect ship version. And so you can see on the left sort of what it looks like in the well deck. The idea is that there's sort of a mid-channel that allows you to still have the thing floating, but you can sort of walk up to it. Once it's in, you can sort of pump the water out, and so it can rest on the deck. And so you can do maintenance. You got to have enough room to get around it and do maintenance and stuff like that. You need some overhead clearance because when it's floating, you lose some of that overhead. And that dotted line is the line they're imagining an overhead crane that can do things like bring in mission packages and stuff like that. I think the idea is that when the well deck is flooded, that crane is all the way forward out of the way. When they close the door and pump the water out, and the MDV moves down to the bottom, that's when they can bring the crane in play.
Yeah, the well deck's going to need a lot of strengthening too for two vehicles of this size.
Yeah. This is 100 and some feet long. I meant to put the exact stats up, but it's a pretty good size thing.
Well, it's also 450 tons.
Yeah. Which, if you go back, doesn't that sound very Street Fighter-like?
Oh, it sounds very Street Fighter.
Yeah. It sounds very Street Fighter-like. And it's got a nice big helicopter deck with the idea that you can basically refuel and reload helicopters, and that makes me very happy. The idea of being able to put a helicopter deck 200 miles away from the rest of the force, you know, if you can put missiles on it in addition to having a helicopter deck, that's fantastic.
Well, the other thing,
carry a helicopter, but it is going to be able to refuel one.
Well, what I like about it is that you could configure it for rotary UAVs as well.
Yeah.
Which really turns this into a significant scout force.
Yes. And that's sort of their idea, is that they'd send this ahead and they'd use it for scouting. They talk about it in an anti-air war, but if you look at the details of that mission, it's basically an early warning thing. But it doesn't even really, I mean, there's not much of a radar you can put on this thing.
Well, the only radar they talked about was surface search.
Yeah.
Which could do air search in a limited altitude mode. But in surface warfare, this would have some really interesting capabilities.
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of nifty. So the other one they looked at, that is one that I meant to hide. Here we go. The hybrid hydrofoil. And so what makes it a hybrid is that it's got this sort of hull underneath that makes it kind of look like, instead of being a swath, single, I'm trying to, waterplane area. What's the S stand for in swath? Submerged?
Semi-submerged.
Semi-submerged waterplane area twin hull. This would be a semi-submerged waterplane area mono hull. And the idea is that it's got wings so that when it gets up to speed, the wings provide lift and it lifts it out of the water. And as a result, it's got a very low amount of drag and it can go really fast. But
docking it
is a little bit trickier in that there's two things that has here. One is the blocks to keep it from tipping over and from putting a whole bunch of stress on that strut. And the other thing is a slot in the bottom of the well deck. And their thought is that you sort of slide it into this slot, and the slot has like inflatable rubber seals. And so once you get it in place and on the, over the blocks, and ballasted it down however you want it, the inflatable seals inflate and create a watertight seal. Okay, sure it is.
I think docking this thing's like threading a needle.
Yeah, and just imagine doing this in any sort of sea state. And they make
or at night.
Yeah, they made some comment about, we think we could launch it up to sea state 5, but we're kind of surprised if we could get it back on board on anything less than 4, anything greater than 4. And I'm not sure I believe 4. I'm not sure I believe 4. So this is clearly a more technically challenging option. This one has a much higher degree of risk, I think, but it's potentially, it's potentially at least somewhat faster. Although the other one, I mean, it's sitting on a bubble of air. Most of the displacement is up on a bubble of air, so it's got some speed potential there. Okay, so this is what they look like when you put them side by side. That hydrofoil one is a little bit shorter. The one that they designed is a little bit shorter. I don't know why they didn't just lengthen it out a little bit. I think they had a requirement and they designed to the requirement, and that's what they concluded they needed to meet the requirement. If you made it a little bit bigger, you could put more weapons on it.
But it would be, I think the weight would be too high. They were really trying to keep the weight down, and if you extend it, it's not just the upper hull. You've got the semi-submerged part.
Yeah,
too.
that's a good point.
So you're going to blow out your weight limits.
Yeah, that was probably it. It was probably weight. And for these, they talk about they look like for the surface effect one, they looked at, I think, 2 different lengths, and they went with the longer one because they concluded the longer one was much better. But, they had the weight constraints that they had to look at. So that's what they looked at. But I noticed that there's some other things that when I look at it, I go, that would fit, or it would come close to fitting, close enough that you could re-engineer it. Specifically, in the upper right-hand corner, we have an Iranian missile corvette. I did not get a width on it, but I think it fits within the 50-foot limit. It fits within the length limit. In the upper left-hand corner, you have a Chinese Hubei missile catamaran, and the width and the length work. The height is problematic, but not just that mast, which you'd have to make the mast fold, but potentially the missile containers in the back are problematic too. But you could probably engineer those to be lower if you had to.
Well, you take out the housing and you make them elevating mounts.
Yeah, exactly. So you could probably do something like that. Now, note that none of the things that I'm showing you here have a helo deck. And so helo deck was a very important part of this. None of these have helo decks. The third one is the Sea Hunter. And the Sea Hunter is an unmanned surface vehicle designed to hunt submarines. And the idea is it has a relatively short-ranged active sonar, and it goes, and when it finds a submarine, it just follows it around, pinging away at it. Ping, 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 keeping track of it, making its life a living hell.
Did they ever put the sonar on it? Because when I talked to the folks the last year in space I was at, they said they didn't have the weight or the power. So it turned it into a totally an unmanned navigation platform.
Yeah, and the other thing with this is, I know that lengthwise it works. I don't know if widthwise it works. I think it probably does. I certainly don't know if the draft works. And so if you've got a sonar that's underneath the thing,
it would probably be World War II-ish. It would be one that drops down.
Yeah, and that's
you could drop down.
They talked about a dipping sonar for the
No. Most hull sonars in World War II were retractable.
No, I understand.
Okay.
But I'm saying that, even the other ones talked about having a sonar, but it was going to be a dipping. They were going to use a dipping sonar based upon a helicopter sonar.
Yeah. Why they just go with the CAPTAS one and be done?
Yeah. There's some options there, but in this case, I don't know if Sea Hunter has any viability whatsoever. This was a DARPA project, and the thing about DARPA projects is I'm a big fan of experimentation. I always say, I frequently will say in my personal life, the experiment was a success. I learned never to do that again. So the only unsuccessful experiments are the ones where you didn't think it through in advance and you didn't learn anything from the experiment. If you learned something from the experiment, you had reason to think that X was true, and even if you learned that X isn't true, that's still a decent experiment and worth doing. So these are the sorts of things that you could put in here. Now, all of these things, if you wanted to run all this through the science fiction converter, especially those two at the top, what you're really looking at is battle riders, right?
No, battle riders are big. You should have pulled up a LAC.
LACs are bigger than these things are.
Battle riders?
These aren't battle riders. These are.
Oh, okay. Because I'm thinking Traveler battle riders. Those are dreadnoughts without jump drives.
Yeah, the thing is, so battle riders come in a couple of different flavors in Traveler. In the T&E era, they specifically had ones that were when they didn't have the tech base that they used to, they specifically had ones that were a lot smaller. I have a tendency to think of them as things like in the upper right-hand corner, we have a Dragon class system defense boat, which is all of these, I think, if I remember correctly, are 400 tons. The Dragon might be 500, but I think it's a 400-ton system defense boat. The two other illustrations are two different interpretations of the Fiery class Gunned Escort, which is basically a Gazelle class with streamlining so that it can go through an atmosphere. The one on the right is the original Tom Peters version. The one on the left is the Jesse DeGraff version. So Tom Peters did a lot of art in the Traveler and Mega Traveler era, and Jesse DeGraff did a lot of art in the GURPS Traveler era. And so Jesse did his interpretation of Tom's work. I like both of them. I like Tom's design a little bit more. And you look at first glance, you look at it and you go, they're identical. If you look at it, they're not. Like if you look at the space between the engines, in Tom Peters, it's an elevated thing. In Jesse DeGraff's, it's actually about even with the top of those engine clusters. Mm-hmm. There's a few other changes there in terms of like how far back the turrets are and stuff like that. They're both beautiful. I love both, right? And there have been some other interpretations also. And at some point, my friend Brian Haven is printing me out a 3D printed version of yet another version of this. But it's going to be about a foot long-ish. Mm. So, and in fact, he may have already printed it. I just need to go to, I'll probably pick it up in January when I go to MarsCon. So that weekend in January, towards the third week in January, where I think I had it as a no, but with an asterisk on it. The reason why there's an asterisk is I'm not going to plan on doing a show, but those of you who remember last year's MarsCon, we did a special episode unnumbered from MarsCon. David Weber was on and a few other people were on, that we just sort of did in the hotel room. I did not necessarily trust the internet to work. And so it was sort of an experiment. It's like, we'll see if this works. The show may be over in 5 minutes. But we may do something like that again. Tom and I were talking about that just yesterday, actually. So, okay, so that's it for what I've got for slides. So let me bring us back to there, and let's go through and look at the comments and see if there's anything. Paul points out the Starfire series by David Weber is all about carriers and carrier fighter bomber wings in space. Yeah, there's a lot of that stuff in there. David did not create that universe. He was invited to write in it. It was originally created by Steve Cole, who then went on to do Starfleet battles. And once he went on to do Starfleet battles, he didn't care about Starfire anymore. Mm-hmm. And so it was David Weber and Steve White wrote novels in the Starfire universe, and that's how I became aware of David Weber. David's first novel was Insurrection in the Starfire universe, and there used to be a science fiction. It was new and used, a science fiction bookstore in Richmond, Virginia, and I walk in and there's a display. And I went, hey, I know what the Starfire universe is. Paul also points out Steve Galacci is the author of Albedo. So Steve's got a website. You can go look at some of his work. He does a lot of technical stuff. He was an Air Force technical draftsman type. That's how he got started in art or professional art. Olive says that, come to think of it, I wonder if Albedo comics are online or anything. I went looking and I couldn't find them. I find pages here and there. Steve Galacci has some stuff up on his site, but it's just like pages. It's illustrations of it. And my stuff is all in storage. And it's made more complicated by the fact that there was, it came out as a comic, and then all the Irma Felna stuff got pulled together, and there was a couple of different flavors of stuff. So I remember, and you'd think that at some point somebody would do a list that says, this thing is a reprint that has this, 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 and this in it. You'd think. If that list exists, I've never been able to find it. Wright points out that there's a Vangelis album called Albedo 0.39. Indeed, it was. Okay. Yeah, Olive points out with hypersonics, I guess the key thing is hitting things soonest. That's a piece of it. The other thing is just the faster I'm coming in, the fewer opportunities they have to shoot at it. And the faster they have to make a decision in order to shoot at it at all. If the other guy has a 5-minute loop and I can schwack him in 3 minutes, he doesn't even get a chance to fire. So at some point, Chris, I should throw up that. I need to find that chart that you showed me, the illustration from the Soviet manual.
Oh, yeah, with the engagement timeline. Yeah,
the engagement range, and it shows the missiles going off, etc. That's a fantastic graphic.
Yeah.
Horrible country, fantastic graphic.
If you can't find it, let me know.
I've got it somewhere. But yeah. So, long discussion about AI stuff and how you would do all that stuff. And it's AI in warfare is really interesting. So in my other hobby thing, I run this wargaming conference that's in April called Connections Online. This year, the topic is wargaming future technologies. And part of the deal with this is we're looking at how to wargame AI and wargaming both. And so I've been reading stuff about how AI is going to change warfare and how to think about it, trying to wrap my arms around it. And boy, it's vague. A lot of it just sort of seems to come across as, we'll be able to make better decisions faster. It's like, okay, from a how to wargame that standpoint, it's like, all right, I'll give a +3 to the die roll rather than a +2.
Most of the articles, it sounds like Aegis Doctrine, Next Generation.
Yeah. So it's like everything happens automatically. Now, it's a really interesting exception to that rule. There's a guy named Peter Layton. He's an Aussie. He wrote a white paper called Fighting Artificial Intelligence Battles. Came out maybe 3 years ago now. And Layton makes the argument that we may have to rethink the OODA loop. The OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, act, is a very reactive way of handling things. And we talk about our OODA loop being faster than the other guy's OODA loop, but it's still, you have to observe and orient and then decide, and then you act. So it's still very reactive. Layton talks about the idea that maybe what your AI gives you is the ability to be way more predictive. And so you're not waiting to observe stuff, or you're probably more accurately, you're doing it on an entirely different time scale. So you're being predictive about how you're going to react to stuff, or you're making your decision based upon what you're predicting as opposed to what you're seeing.
Yeah, you're doing decide and act before observe. So what you're really doing when you send a weapon or a UAV is it does not have to come back to you for permission to fire. You're saying there's something out there, go find it, kill it. So I don't say that the OODA loop goes away. I'm just saying it's reversed.
Yeah. Well, the example that I give for all this, if you want to understand this thinking, go watch the movie. Oh, I'm blanking on the title. All right, give me just a second. It's one of the Gun-Kata movies. Ultraviolet with Mila Jovanovic is an example of it, but that's not the one I would go with. The one I would go with is... Oh, really? Really? You're not just going to give me a list of all this stuff? You're going to make me read it? Oh, it's driving me crazy that I can't think of this. Okay, hold on a second. Let me look up Gun-Kata. Equilibrium. Yeah, Equilibrium. Okay, which is a very interesting movie. It's got Sean Bean in it. It's got John Pertwee's son, Sean Pertwee, I think, also. Angus McFadden is in it, and Christian Bale is in it.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea behind it is Gun-Kata is a martial art that's based upon the analysis of tens of thousands of gun battles. And if you've done the analysis and you're a good practitioner of Gun-Kata, you can predict how the battle is going to work out based upon the input variables that you see at the beginning of it. And so basically the idea is that when the guy pops out from behind the area, you've already got your gun pointed there. You may not even be looking in that direction, but you've got your gun pointed there and you're pulling the trigger because you know that statistically it's time for him to pop out right about there, even if you didn't know he was there. Exactly. And so the idea is that it's very, very predictive. And at some point, I'm going to do a read along of the Exordium series. Exordium is Gun-Kata with spaceships because they've got one faster than light weapon. They've got a tactically useful FTL drive, so they can do micro jumps all over the place, but their sensors are all speed of light. So a lot of times they're firing shots at where they predict the guy is going to be. Ramius always turns to starboard at the bottom of the hour, and he's going to find a torpedo waiting for him when he gets there. So I think, to tie this back to why I went down this side trip on Gun-Kata, Peter Layton, I think, is basically saying, yeah, Gun-Kata. AI can potentially give you the ability to be predictive about where things are. So like you fire them in the most extreme example, when there's this, what's it called? Project Longbow, I think, is the thing it's basically the cruise missile that fires air-to-air missiles. And so the idea is that you can carry this thing under wing and then you can shoot it and then it can fire missiles when it gets there. What if you were in a situation where you're basically firing your long-range missiles before the target has gotten to the point where where you can tell that the target's going to be there, right? You're making
that's just what you're supposed to do while shooting. Just by the by, if you're tracking someone to shoot them, You shoot ahead.
No. I'm not talking about leading the target. I'm talking about not knowing the target's there, but basically firing on spec.
Yep.
Okay, so it's predicting that there's a target there and guessing that there should be something there based on strategies that have been made in the past.
So now the thing is, the gunfire analogy breaks down a little bit because bullets are so much faster than people. But the idea is basically that you pull the trigger and you're making this prediction that when the bullet arrives, there will be something for the bullet to hit, even though right now there isn't anything for the bullet to hit.
Fair.
So.
And I'm just looking at all the ways I can use EW to screw that AI to hell.
Well, it's sort of interesting because there's I've had this conversation with one or two other people, including a curmudgeonly person from the Naval Undersea Warfare Center, Newport, who you and I both know. Yeah. And his attitude about all this is that I can foil this just by having 6 different options that I'm going to do, and I'll just roll a D6 against them, because this was specifically in the context of a war game where they were going to make people show their move in advance, right? So they were going to try to operationalize this predictive ability by if I have the predictive ability, you have to show me.
I love the idea of for a war game. It's like, fuck it, I don't know what we should do. That's a 6. All right, we'll go there.
Well, Alyssa, it's not as far-fetched as that. When I was on my boat, when we were looking at doing a baffle clearing maneuver, we had 6 maneuvers, and we rolled a D6.
Yep.
To determine which maneuver we were going to execute.
Because you wanted to be random, you didn't want to be predictable. Now, the thing here, though, the reason why I think that falls down in a wargaming context is because our dear mutual friend was gaming the system there. He wasn't actually dealing with an attribute of what the game was trying to represent. He was actually attacking the game itself.
Yeah. Which he does all the time.
What you're saying is he was wargame metagaming.
Yes.
Yeah, he was metagaming, and the thing is that's all well and good, except it wasn't particularly. I don't think it was helpful in this particular case, because my response to that would be, in the real world, in the game, we ignore things like if you're going to do air-to-air refueling, you have to arrange for it and launch it.
Yep.
We just abstract all that away. And so he's making the assumption that he can abstract away the planning of things that he cannot abstract away the planning of, right? I can use that to make the decision about what I'm going to do, but I can't wait until the airplane needs fuel to decide whether I launched the tanker or not.
Yeah, no, that's something you need to plan in advance for.
Yeah.
Pilots are picky.
Yeah, and so I've never had the opportunity to go back and have a longer discussion with him about this because he was in curmudgeon mood, and I needed to catch him when he wasn't in curmudgeon mood.
When we got time, I will tell you what I did to the Pac Fleet staff during Global 99. Where the white cell came to me afterwards and said, how could you predict that? And I said, simple. Pain reaction.
Yeah.
Really and truly, if you think about a lot of human motivation, it comes down to, I don't want pain response.
Yep.
Whether that's how we communicate or don't communicate with people, or we're talking about physically.
So,
yes.
All right. So I'm going back to looking through the comments to see if there's any to throw out here. Michael Boretsky asked the question, Wouldn't a hypersonic missile be more vulnerable to damage due to aerodynamic forces on the damaged area? Short answer, yes.
If you've got a stressed area, you've got a stressed area.
Long answer, if you're talking about damage effects of a missile, speed rarely exceeds the damage potential of the warhead.
No, he's talking about damage. I think he's talking about damage to the missile.
I think the way I read that was damage to the missile itself.
Yeah, if you hit the missile, it really doesn't matter.
Yeah. Yeah, it's harder to hit. The thing is, that's pretty much true with all missiles, right?
Yeah. I would think so, given that it's usually rocket propelled.
Yeah, if you tap the missile, you win as a general rule.
Yeah.
I can't. If you hit it close enough to the target and cause it to break up, then you might be dealing with a supersonic shotgun effect.
Yeah, it's called the 3-second rule.
Yeah. Yeah. If you
destroy it 3 seconds or less to you, you are taking shrapnel, period.
Yeah. And usually, almost always, screwing up the exquisitely timed detonation of the warhead is probably in your best interest, even if you're going to take a bunch of shrapnel.
Yeah, like whether or not you take the shrapnel is still preferable to fire, explosion, and shrapnel, as well as any hazards like falling buildings that might occur.
Yep.
I'm not worrying about falling buildings.
It depends on the situation, obviously.
Yeah, Bob summarizes it. Hypersonic weapons are more sensitive to damage. The trick is putting sufficient damage onto it. It doesn't take much, but it does take damage. Okay.
It is harder to hit.
So, yeah, it is harder to hit. So Paul opens up the can of worms about detectability in space. This is worth an episode, and it's on the list. I do want to do one. I want to pull Andy Presby into it because he and I have been talking about this subject for 15 years.
I think it depends on where it gets lost, honestly, because if it's radiating heat, but it's around a freaking star system, The
short answer is there's a whole page or two of assumptions that you have to be specific about. And they include things like, what's your sensor technology look like? So yeah, in theory, I'm going to be able to see something against the background because it's going to end up being warmer than the background. In theory. The thing is, the background is not a constant temperature. You have to have sensors to in a position where it can see stuff. Sensors.
That's the big one. You have to be looking in the right area.
Well, people say, well, I'll just put enough sensors out to cover everything. It's like, okay, yeah, that's easier said than done, and that's really, really effing expensive. And so a lot of those things make a difference. And then you've got the OODA loop problem, in that if you've got like a tactically useful FTL drive, maybe the answer is, if I wait for 3 weeks, you can get me, but I'm not going to wait for 3 weeks. I'm going to be in and out. Right now, if you're talking about your typical magic fusion torch, where you come out of hyperspace out beyond the orbit of Pluto, and then you spend the next 3 weeks with this big fusion plume, yeah, I'm going to see you coming. But that's a specific set of assumptions. So the long answer is the short answer is the people who tell you no, there's no hiding in space are making a lot of assumptions that they're just not telling you about. It's more complicated than that. And I will point out that if you use the same sort of assumptions that they use to tell you there's no hiding in space, there's no hiding on Earth either. Submarines can't hide. Stealth airplanes can't hide. Nothing can hide.
Nothing can truly hide because there are means of detecting it, whether that's visual or otherwise.
Yeah, but but it's hard.
Oh yeah.
And I don't have to hide forever. I just have to hide long.
You just have to hide long enough to do the damage you're trying to do.
Yeah. I mean,
or I have to be able to convince the other guy that it's not worth doing the exquisite solution. Like, yeah, if you gave everybody an extra $1 billion to spend on air defense, you'd make it a lot harder. Most countries don't have an extra $1 billion to spend on air defense.
Yep.
Oh, and it's probably more like $1 billion a year.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's just the maintenance cost. That's not counting like the personnel and everything.
Phil Banks says you can use radiators or heat sinks to shift where and how much you radiate.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but only to a certain degree.
That's not as useful as you might think, because for two reasons. One is you need to know where the sensor is, and you need to have a clear field of view away from the sensor. So, like if you're in U.S. airspace, I just need to like be stealthy in the direction that the radars are from. The radars are coming from all directions, right? If the sensors are coming from all directions, you may not have a place where you can radiate. And if it's a moving target, you have to know where the sensors are. So like if it's a cat and mouse game, you need to be able to detect the other ship. Well, up until the point where you detect the thing that's trying to detect you, you're detectable because you don't know which direction to radiate in. So it's another case of
making a lot of assumptions about things.
Yeah. In theory, it's possible. In practice, it's a lot harder than it first sounds.
Yeah, there's too many variables that you're unable to control in practice.
So Paul asked the questions, why don't submarines carry UAVs to extend their line of sight? What makes you think they're not?
Yeah,
why would you think that they're not?
There's a couple of...
With the way we do our military, like, they work in tandem.
Yeah.
Well, basically what he's talking about, Liz, is submarine deployed UAVs. Yeah. And the answer is there are a couple of designs out there. And one of them is popped out of the signal ejector,
which is a 3-inch tube.
Yep.
That the independent duty corpsman gets to fire stuff out of.
Yeah. Larry and I used it in a couple of our novels.
Yeah, I seem to remember that.
Mm-hmm.
I seem to remember that. The other thing about controlling a UAV is it does put you in a situation where you basically have to have a mast sticking up.
If you're going to use a UAV, there's a mast up.
Okay, so here's the thing though, Olive, with this one, even if you're taking fictional hyperspace into account, they're based on real world physics and stuff, there is still a detectable presence even in hyperspace. There would be some outside detection, like a ripple essentially in space-time, or insert thing here. There's not going to be no undetectable way to do that even with hyperspace.
It depends on what hyperspace is. Now, can you detect if both are in hyperspace? Yes. Hyperspace versus normal space, it depends upon what the metric is. For example, the Honor Harrington universe. You detect the transitions in and out, but not in unless you are in hyperspace as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And
if you're in a gravity wave, good luck with that too.
I think we see exactly, if I remember correctly, one battle that takes place in hyperspace.
Yeah, that's when Helen Zwicky was lost.
Helen Zewicki's mother.
Yeah, her name was Helen too.
Oh, I had forgotten that part. Yeah, you're right. She was named Helen also. Okay, let's see. Scrolling. Randall Wong said that the upper right is Batman's design. So yeah, the Iranian missile corvette does kind of look like something Batman.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Appropriate, given I have the Batman onesie on today. And it has little ears.
Sea Hunter might be helpful against smugglers. It doesn't have the right sensors for smugglers. It's really designed for submarines.
Well, it's got a radar, and right now that's its only sensor.
Yeah, but I mean, it's like a nav radar, right? It's like a Furuno.
Well, yeah, it's an S-band, so it's a long-range radar, navigation radar, but that's all it's got.
Yeah.
I mean, they were thinking about a active sonar, but at that size, you're talking a helicopter dipping type thing, so you're talking 10 plus kilohertz. So good luck finding anything, because they hear you coming much further away than you have any chance of picking them up. Another point that I didn't quite get a good answer for at sea or in space.
What?
Yeah. Yeah, I haven't been to sea or space in a while, and I miss it.
Neither have I. I mean, the last one was 2016. That was fun.
Now, I do I did hear something interesting. We haven't talked about this idea. We probably should. The U.S. Navy is doing all sorts of experiments with reloading VLS at sea.
It's about time.
You may recall that back at Sierra Space, the Port Hueneme people at one point were showing all sorts of fancy slick paper stuff about the system that they were working on that was going to do all that stuff.
Yeah.
And so I finally saw something a couple of weeks ago, because I wondered, the Port Hueneme stuff just like disappeared. And I think the answer was, we decided that there wasn't a compelling need for us to be able to do that. It was easier just to pull into a port, so we didn't bother developing the need. And now we've got a need to be able to reload stuff at sea again. And so I wondered whatever happened to the Port Hueneme stuff. Did that stuff just like not work? And they're starting over?
Well, when you get a chance, come over. I'll show you the 2 volumes I've got from Dr. Marvin Miller, where he talks about the new one.
And we talked about the new one or the old one?
Well, it was his new one to what we're using now.
Okay. Because I saw something somewhere recently that said something to the effect of yeah, this is the same system.
I think it is. Yeah.
Now, that's interesting, because one of the things that system had was you would send a couple of dudes over who would actually run it. So the locals weren't going to run it. The guys from the supply ship were going to come over, and they were the guys that were going to actually do the reloading.
Yep.
So it'll be interesting to see if that's what it is, because there was a big piece of gear that would come over, and it would basically clamp on top of the.
And do you know where that came from?
No.
If you look at it real carefully, it is the same reloading funnel, if you will, that the Mark 45 VLS on a submarine uses.
Oh. So one of the advantages of this thing is that you'd lock it over the tube, and then it could pick up the missile. And the thing is, since it was locked into vertical over the tube, as the ship is doing this, the frame that's holding the missile is staying perpendicular to the deck of the ship.
And then the frame orients the cell.
Yes.
It's easier to do when circular. So don't be surprised in the future. The next VLS system does not have circular loading components. Like everybody else.
Yeah. 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 So, okay, let's see. let's see. I'm scrolling. Lots of stuff there tonight. Okay, I think I've gotten to the end. Oh, no. Yep, now I've gotten to the end. Okay, so nothing else that jumps out at me is something that we should jump on the grenade, especially since we're at the hour and 35-minute mark. And so I think we're probably at the point where we should declare victory. With that in mind, I'd like to say, first of all, thank you, Chris, for joining me. And I don't know when the next time we're going to have you on, but I'm sure there will be a next time.
I'm pretty sure too.
And the other thing is, I'd like to say, as always, I am incredibly pleased and humbled that there's a group of people that are willing to spend their Saturday night listening to me and whoever else is on the show with me talk about these sorts of things. I really appreciate the fact that you guys are here watching this, and I'm looking forward to continuing to do it next year. So with that in mind, Lissa, are you still here?
Oh, come on. There we go.
So I just wanted to make sure that you were going to take us out instead of me having to take us out. Because for what it's worth, in StreamYard, I can sort of see, because I'm an administrator, I can see the pictures of people, but Lissa, if Lissa's out running around or something, she'll not have her camera on, and so her camera was off. And
no, a good portion of the time I'll just turn my camera off so I can like be a dumbass behind the scenes and not look like an idiot. That's really what that comes down to, Chris.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I totally understand.
There have been plenty of times where like I'm behind the scenes like fidgeting with like my clothes or whatever, and I'm like, I don't want that being shown on camera.
Yeah, like we always have to tell people for connections online, like there's no reason why you have to just sit there stone faced the entire time, but we recommend that you turn your camera off if you want to like eat a sandwich or something, right? Just go ahead and turn your camera off. It'll be
like it's not a huge deal, but at the same time, just like sometimes you want a little bit of privacy.
Exactly. But as I was saying, so thank you very much, everybody, for attending once again. And I look forward to doing this in the new year. Remember, the next show is going to be like the 11th of January. Because I'm leaving town to go do the Christmas thing. And I'll come back on like the 3rd, but won't be ready to do a show in the 4th. So the next show is going to be on the 11th. So thank you very much, everybody, and we'll see you next time.
Happy holidays.
Yep.
Happy holidays.